Thank you very much indeed. And I must say that I am genuinely honoured and slightly intimidated as well to be invited by the WI to speak. Intimidated because a year or so ago I asked my mother if she would like me to talk at her very small WI in Shropshire. And she looked at me and said, "Darling, do you think you could make your work sound interesting?" So there's nothing like being brought down to earth by your mother. So that's why I'm slightly intimidated. But I'm honoured because the WI is fantastic when it comes to many reasons, but for environmental campaigning, they are second to none. We've just been hearing about the work you've been doing with urban trees, pollinators, bees, climate change, and also as well, you have been leading the way when it comes to campaigning about plastic pollution with your End Plastic Soup. You folks have been amazing. And let us not forget as well that in 1954, it was the WI that established Keep Britain Tidy. So what a huge environmental pedigree you guys have. So that is why I'm honoured to be speaking to you about plastic waste. But let's start from the beginning when it comes to plastic. And it all starts with exploding billiard balls. Because in the mid-1800s, billiards, or crossing the Atlantic pool, was becoming more and more popular. And the makers of the balls wanted a cheaper alternative because at the time they were made from ivory. So they wanted to kind of make an alternative. And so they offered a competition of about $10,000 at the time for anyone that could come up with something that was as good as ivory for billiard or pool balls. And there were several kind of inventions, and one of them was the first real type of plastic. It didn't win the prize, mainly because the problem was the billiard balls kept exploding because it was quite an unstable product. But since then, since the mid-1800s, the process has been refined and improved. And in 1907, Leo Baekeland came up with what we now know as Bakelite, so the first type of really useful plastic. And since then, we have used plastic to improve just about every single aspect of our lives, from education, safety, entertainment, food preservation, medical supplies. Plastic has been fantastic, and it has helped modern life be what it is today. And we love plastic. In fact, we love it so much that since the end of the Second World War, when plastic production really kind of kicked off, we have made 8.3 billion tons of plastic. Nothing has been made by humans on such a vast and rapid scale apart from steel and concrete. 8.3 billion tons. And as I say, it has improved so much of our lives. But unfortunately, as we are all too aware, so much of the plastic that we are now producing is single use. We use it once and then we throw it away. And some of this is good. Some of this is really important. I personally wouldn't want to go into a hospital that didn't use single-use plastic items. They save lives. But so much of it is unnecessary. And it's this stealth plastic use which has crept up on us. And that is now becoming the problem. Because we not just produce an awful lot of plastic, we also throw away an awful lot of plastic. 300 million tons of plastics gets thrown away every single year. And the problem with plastic is one of its strengths, its durability. We like plastic because it's so durable, but that is the problem with it. It's so durable. Plastic doesn't rot away, it doesn't break down, it doesn't decompose like other products like like paper or card or anything else, or even metal would. Instead, it stays as plastic. In fact, it stays as plastic for hundreds, thousands of years. There's evidence to suggest that plastic will now become fossilized. So the geological indicator that we were here will be a thin layer of plastic. That is quite a scary thought. And what happens to this plastic that we throw away? Well, unfortunately as well, it's an uncomfortable truth that so much of this plastic ends up in our environment. Our disposal system is not perfect in this country, and other countries are far, far worse. So much plastic ends up in our environment, where ultimately often ends up in our seas and our oceans, where it produces these huge floating islands of plastic, and it washes up on our beaches too. And just to kind of give you some kind of scale of the problem here, told you now that plastic stays around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and will become fossilized. But to put that on a more realistic and a shorter timescale, it means that every single piece of plastic which you have ever used or ever come into contact with, unless it's been burnt or recycled, and a tiny fraction of plastic actually is. So every piece of plastic that you've ever used, so every toothbrush which you've ever used is still out there as a piece of plastic, as a toothbrush. It may be floating around, it may be on a beach, or it may be in a landfill, but it's still there as a piece of plastic. What happens to this plastic when it's floating around in our seas and our oceans? Well, I am sure that we have all seen some of the horrific footage on Blue Planet and other places as well of what happens to this plastic when it's in our seas and our oceans. It entangles and drowns all types of marine life. It fills the stomachs of birds and other wildlife as well, which thinks it's food, and it causes untold damage. It kills thousands of animals every single year. And the problem gets even more worrying as well, because this is the visible plastic that we see. This is the visual issues that we see. But there is another issue, and it's the invisible side of the plastic pollution crisis, and that is microplastics. I've told you that plastic doesn't break down, it doesn't decompose, but it does break up. It can break up into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. And when these pieces become 5 millimeters or less, so about the size of a grain of rice, they're classed as microplastics. And everything that is made of plastic will produce microplastics to some degree. Two of the biggest sources of microplastics are clothing. So every time that you put on your washing machine, you can be releasing around 700,000 pieces of plastic fragments. And the other biggest source are car tires. 500,000 tons of car tire wear fragments are released across Europe every single year. Everything that is made of plastic will shed, to some degree, microplastics. And where are these microplastics? Where are they ending up? Well, we've known for around about 20 years or so that many of these microplastics are in our seas and our oceans, which is no surprise, because we can see the floating islands of plastic waste in parts of our planet. But a couple of years ago, I led a group of researchers with Friends of the Earth from Bangor University to look at inland waters in the UK. And it was the first time this has been done, or any kind of project like this has been done anywhere. And we found for the first time that microplastics were in every single bit of water which we looked at. This was from the River Thames right up to remote lochs in Scotland. There was microplastics in every single one of them. And this led us on to doing some more work. So we then started working with We Swim Wild and Laura Sanderson, who is a professional world swimmer. And we started collecting samples from all sorts of places, including the top of Snowdon, so the lake at the top of Snowdon. And again, we found microplastics right at the top of Snowdon. And now we're working with dozens of volunteers to lead one of the UK's, potentially the world's largest microplastic citizen science project of its kind. And we're getting samples sent from all over the UK, from every county of the UK, and we'll analyse them at Bangor University for microplastics to help us map out where these microplastics are in our waters. We're also working with Surfers Against Sewage, a kind of a really leading organisation, along with WI, and actually work alongside WI sometimes, to look at the microplastic problem. And so there, again, we're looking at some estuaries and how microplastics move around in estuaries. Are they coming in from the sea, or are they going out with the rivers? How's this movement of microplastics working? But we're looking at microplastics in the air, in people's homes. So we're getting people to send us samples from their houses to find out how much microplastic is floating around in the air. And when we did this started this work 2 years ago, it was kind of quite novel. And everything we were finding was quite exciting. And since then, there has been an explosion in the scientific community, with people trying to find or finding microplastics in the most unusual places. And so when I ask you, where are these microplastics? Unfortunately, the truth now is they are everywhere. We've found them at the top of Everest, we've found them at the deepest ocean, we've found them in human cells, we've found them in placentas, we have found them in the rain, we have found them in absolutely everywhere. In fact, it would be harder now to try to find out where microplastics aren't. That is the problem. Microplastics have been found absolutely everywhere. And there's this one here, which is one of the ones I kind of want to highlight here, is that they estimate that all of us ingest around about a credit card size worth amount of plastic every single week. All of us are ingesting plastic. How are we ingesting it? We're breathing it in. If you take a deep breath now, you've probably inhaled some microplastics. It's in our food. It's getting it right. It's starting off by getting it right at the bottom of the food chain in plankton, and it's working all its way up in the food chain. We are ingesting and eating microplastics with every single meal. What's the problem? Why do we care about this? I mean, plastic's inert. That's why we use it. That's one of the reasons why we love it so much. It doesn't have any effects, does it? Now, this is where we have to state that the problem of plastics and the problems of microplastics are we don't yet know. We really, genuinely don't yet know the full consequences of what is happening when that plastic gets inside us. We know that microplastics or plastics can leach harmful chemicals. We also know that microplastics can act as vectors or kind of homes for a whole range of different microorganisms, some of them harmful. We do know as well that microplastics are having detrimental effects to certain parts of our ecology, such as soil health, and it is affecting some animals as well. Experiments and trials have been done. But the full problems, we just don't yet know. But the worrying thing is that more and more of these studies are finding more and more problems with microplastics. And what we can't afford, or we hope is not going to happen, is that microplastics are the tobacco of the 21st century, or the lead, or the DDT of the 21st century. A product which we once thought was brilliant and has fantastic implications. Is it actually starting to harm us and have huge implications? That's what we hope is not going to be the case. But we need to continue the studies. So what can we do about this? Okay, so it's starting to look like we don't want all this microplastics floating around, and we certainly don't want those floating islands of plastic waste, and we don't want our seas and our streets and our rivers to have plastic in them. So what can we do about the problem? Well, the first thing, as I've mentioned, is we need to discover and monitor the level of the problem. We need to find out the implications of this plastic in our environment and in our actual bodies as well, and in wildlife. We need to discover and find out the problems. And we also need to find out where these microplastics are. I've mentioned there some of the work that we've been doing, but in the Plastic Research Centre of Wales at Bangor University, we're looking at this in a whole range of different habitats and how it's affecting a whole range of different organisms as well. And it's crucial that we do that, because if we find out tomorrow, next week, next year, that microplastics are actually having a serious problem, then we need to know straight off where the hotspots of microplastic production are, how are they moving around the environment. We need to know that so we can then start to do something. What could we possibly do? Well, we could start to look at ways to remove microplastics from the environment, from waterways as well. And again, in Bangor University, we're looking, and other universities, we're looking at ways to do this. We're looking at developing enzymes to ingest and break down microplastics. And we're also looking at producing things like constructed treatment wetlands to filter out and hold back microplastics before they can kind of enter into our water systems. There's lots of things that we can do, use fantastic kind of techniques which are being developed around the world. That's one thing that we can do. But the most important the thing that we have to start doing if we want to start tackling the microplastic pollution problem, the plastic pollution crisis, is we have to reduce our consumption of plastic. This is the crucial, fundamental thing that we have to do. And there are lots of ways that we can do this. As again, at the Plastic Research Centre of Wales, we're working at ways to develop alternatives to plastic packaging, looking at ways that we can recycle better, reuse better. There's lots of things that we can do. And there's lots of things that we can do on an individual basis, but crucially as well as a society. We need to start to change the way that we think about plastic. Plastic is fantastic. It truly is. But it is also a serious problem. And we need to start the whole process of what can we do? How can we reduce our use of plastic? And this is when the story, I think, gets positive. Because we know that we have this horrendous problem, this plastic pollution problem. But nothing that I know of has gripped the public's attention in environmental terms as much and excited more people than ever before to actually start to take action than the plastic pollution issue. People are lobbying governments. People are lobbying, campaigning with big businesses. People are getting out and taking direct action. They're doing litter picks. They're really passionate about doing something about the plastic pollution issue. And it's starting to have an effect. Governments and businesses are starting to change the way that they do things. They're starting to legislate to reduce our plastic consumption. Businesses are starting to realize that their consumers, their customers want things to be done differently. Of course, there is more that businesses and the government can do. And they should be doing that. And they should be doing it faster. There's all sorts of things that they could be doing. Making sure there's stronger legislation, making sure that if you produce plastic, single-use plastic, you are thinking about closing the loop. How are you going to collect that plastic? Not just relying on the consumer to get rid of it. What are you going to do as the business? There are so many more things that need to be done, but they're starting to do it. And they're only starting to do it is because the public, you, me, everybody else, is wanting to make a change with this. You know, the theme for this talk is, the stage and the star and the fact that you're an actor in life. Well, the stars of this issue is the general public. They are standing up on their stage, no matter what sort of stage it is, and they are demanding change, and it's starting to happen. And now this is when we twist the whole thing around and bring the whole thing into a circle. We started this talk by saying, this is a catastrophe which could help the planet. And so far, all I've been telling you is all the horrendous things about, the potential horrendous things about plastic. But if we can show that people can show how interested and passionate they can be about tackling an issue like plastic waste, then perhaps we can now engage those people and engage that spirit of wanting change to tackle the biggest issues that we face. Things like, as have been mentioned previously in this meeting, things like biodiversity loss, climate change, climate breakdown. If we can get people excited and show that they can make a difference by doing something about plastic, perhaps we can then engage people, take them with us, create a huge global change for tackling the most serious issues that we face. Because they are all interlinked and interwoven. They're not separate. Although I'm talking about plastic waste and climate change and biodiversity loss, they sound separate issues, but they're not. They are all interlinked. The solutions for tackling them can be different and can be complex and need vast amounts of resources and engagement and societal change to make those effects. But they're all interlinked. And fundamentally, they are all simply solved by one thing that everybody can do to help change, make the planet better in so many ways, and that is not to waste. Plastic is a resource, and like all resources, it should be used wisely, and it shouldn't be wasted. So let's not waste plastic. But while we're at it, let's not waste anything. And if we do that, we can start to make the planet a better place. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of the great Sir David Attenborough. When asked what is the single most important thing that everybody can do to help the planet, he said, well, it's simple. It's simply not to waste. Don't waste plastic. Don't waste food. Don't waste power. Live within our means. And if we can do that, then perhaps this plastic waste problem has shown us a way out of the climate crisis which we face. Thank you very much.